Hey,
Okay, cool. There we go. Hello.
hey, good to finally speak with you.
Likewise, how are you doing?
I'm very good. Let me just
Good.
close everything else on here.
Yep,
Sorry
keep
it took me
everything
so
good.
long to set this up.
That's
I
okay.
apologize.
That's okay, no worries. Had a bit of a hectic couple of months myself starting university, so.
Oh yeah, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm studying musical theatre.
Really?
Yeah. Aiming to be an actor is the goal.
Very nice. I put on a show this past summer. Did you see anything about that on Twitter that I
Uh,
put on?
Tom mentioned it to me in my interview with him, actually recommended I ask you about it.
Uh, okay, I'll send you some afterwards. You might enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, I actually, a friend of mine and I wrote a musical ourselves and put it on earlier this year as well. It was only a workshop though. Um, we took a gap year to sort of get a little bit more experience because we're both quite new to the world of musical theatre. And we thought the best way to get experience if we wrote a show, were in it, directed it, produced it, etc. Get a lot of experience in one.
Yeah, I think that definitely is the best way to get experience in any field, to just sort of get in over your head, but actually do it instead of taking classes that teach you how to do it.
Exactly,
Because
exactly.
you learn a lot more on your own. Is it better if I get my headphones like you have?
It is fine either way, whichever works for you. It's fine either way for me. So
Okay, all right, that's fine. But I have them in here if we need.
no worries. So my first question is a pretty simple one. How long have you wanted to be an author?
Um, that's a really good question. I would say ever since I was a kid is how long I've wanted to be one, but how long I've actually seriously made efforts to try to be one. So, I remember being like 10 years old and thinking, man, I would love to be an author. I really liked books. But then there was sort of this dark ages in my life, creatively speaking. And between like fifth grade, so 12 years old, and like 18, I never read any books for fun. I watched stupid television shows and movies. And I guess I would say that being an author was not my dream at the time. But towards my last year of high school, before I went to college, I sort of rediscovered books and this whole creative world. And I was so influenced by them that I thought I would love to be the person who's writing these things. And so I went to college at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I started off in the business school, but realized that I just really had such a passion for writing that I transferred into the college, the liberal arts school, and studied writing. And then even at the end of college, I knew, 1,000% I wanted to be an author and to be a writer, but I had no idea how to monetize that passion. So I traded commodities, mostly sugar and coffee and soybeans, for 8 years after graduating college, and I was writing on the side. Luckily, the market closed around 2:30, so I would have, 6 to 8 or 10 hours to write every afternoon, and also I wrote while I was at work as well. But so yeah, so it's a long time in the making, and so really that's why Console Wars, just the subject matter, the kind of story I got to tell, and then the response so far, as well as the movie stuff, has really been a dream come true for me.
Yeah.
Whether since I was 12 years old or since I was 18, but it's definitely something that I feel like I've actively been working towards since at least a decade. So it's pretty wonderful.
What was it that first made you think about writing about Sega and Nintendo of all subjects that you could have written about?
Um, Ultimately, what made me write Console Wars and write about Sega and Nintendo was that I wanted to read about Sega and Nintendo. And what made me want to do that was because I was speaking with my brother almost 4 years ago. He asked me what I wanted for my birthday and for Christmas and for Hanukkah. My birthday's in December, and he's a terrible gift giver, or he was. And I told him, I don't want anything from you. No thanks. And he said, no. This year I'm going to make up for all the bad gifts. I have a job. And he asked what was the best gift I ever got, and I said, well, I guess our Sega Genesis that we got when we were kids. I hadn't played one in 15 or 20 years, and so he got me an old Genesis. I started playing it again, and it brought to life a lot of questions, not just personal ones about like, oh, why did we get a Sega Genesis versus a Super Nintendo, or why did I like this game? Why was that game successful? But sort of more business-related questions, like what happened to Sega? Why did I not hear of them anymore? Where did Nintendo come from? Why were they so successful? And my favorite books to read are behind-the-scenes business stories. And so I was looking for one about this, and I went to one of the largest bookstores in Manhattan and asked for one of the books on video game history or the business, and there was nothing in the store. And so that was sort of where the major spark to write the story came from, although, it wasn't really fully clinched for me until I spoke with Tom Kalinske, because prior to that I thought, oh, maybe there's a reason nobody's written about this before. Maybe it's just not that interesting, or maybe there's no human face to put on the story and it's just very dry. But after speaking with Tom, I realized that couldn't be further from the truth. He's such an interesting and dynamic guy. Absolutely. And that was just sort of the tip of the iceberg, because there was Al and Ellen Beth Van Buskirk and Peter Main and Howard Lincoln and Diane Fonacy and hundreds of others, people who I fell in love with writing about. So that was sort of how it all happened.
I must say, it did surprise me, because once Console Wars was first announced, I was very excited for it. I imported it from the US through Amazon, because it came out here a couple of months later. And once I was done, I thought, right, I'm going to read another one of these books, and tried to find something else of a similar nature and just couldn't find anything.
Yeah, it's shocking. Kind of, I had that similar experience. The only thing that was even really tangentially related was David Sheff's book, Game Over, which I was reading, and that's the only one that is really like the style I love, behind-the-scenes business story, and I really enjoyed his book, but I felt like it was starting to get very exciting now that Sega had entered the market and seemed to be challenging Nintendo, that it ended, and I was like, all right, let me read the next one in this series. So I kind of viewed my work as a little bit of a sequel to that. But I'm also and still am surprised that there's so few books on the subject of video games, long-form journalistic pieces, and also it's just so much less than what I would expect.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I liked about how Console Wars was written, I'd read Jeff Ryan's Super Mario, and it was a great book, and because it was very factual, it was structured in a factual sort of way, as opposed to a storytelling type story, which is actually what I expected then from Console Wars. How did you go about shifting through all of these interviews that you had done to creating a coherent story from them?
Well, that was the hardest part of all, absolutely. Since I was 10, I thought I always had an ability to write nice and pretty sentences, but the storytelling part is really the hard part about being an author or a filmmaker that nobody really tells you. You think it's good dialogue or good sentence, but it's telling a story. And part of what really propelled me to doing that was I felt a lot of pressure to get it right. I was so humbled and honored that all these people spent the time to speak with me who had never written a book before, and I felt like I had, my job was basically just to connect the dots. And unlike other subject matters, I had like these incredible dots to connect, so I really had to do it right. And a large part of making it happen was sort of realizing that the best way to do it was through Tom Kalinske being the protagonist of the story. Because if for no other reason, I mean, he did play a large role so fast, but just the time period, Sega was perfect for telling a story of the rise and fall of 1996. And then obviously seeing it through his eyes and learning the industry through him. But that was the hardest part, was I think plotting it out. And that's also where the fact that it took me 3 years to do was really a good thing. I'm sure that at most points along that spectrum, I would have said, all right, let's publish this thing, let's just get it out. But like having the extra time ultimately was for the best, because it made me think about things in a lot of different ways.
How did you actually go about at first after you'd come past the idea and gotten to the I'm going to write this stage? How did you then get into actually contacting people and conducting interviews?
That's a good question. It was very hard at first because I had never written anything before. The few things I had done were produce a small independent movie called The Flying Scissors about competitive rock paper scissors. But that wasn't also a very serious subject matter to say. I'm a hard hitting journalist, and here's my last piece. And so one of my first resources was one that I had actually made a lot of fun of prior to using it, which was LinkedIn.
Right. Yeah.
And so I typed in Sega, I typed in Nintendo, or I typed in Electronic Arts or whatever, and thousands of people would come up. It usually showed what years these people were at the company. Yeah. And I contacted every single person thinking that there's not a perspective that couldn't help. At this point, a number, but that was, with prior. And then as I started to see that, Tom would be a really great focal point, I really put my efforts concurrently towards trying to get him to speak with me. And, to Tom's credit, you spoke with him as well, and you can see him in the story. He's just a incredibly genuine and generous guy, and I was surprised that he was willing to take a chance and give me a few hours of his time. But I was, I guess, able to persuade him through my emails, and then we really hit it off. And I knew after speaking with him that this was a subject I would very happily spend the next few years of my life investigating. And so it was kind of a combination of speaking with Tom and getting that perspective, and then also, as I earned his trust, that helped me earn Al Nilsson's trust, and then, getting two of the main players at Sega to support what you're doing. That helped open up other doors. And another thing that was really helpful for me was that I felt like I was very, very open about the work that I was doing, to the point where I shared, whether it was an outline or an attempted a chapter with Tom and Al and anyone else, because I always wanted them to, one, tell me if I had anything wrong or if it spurred any other memories, but it also, I think, made them feel like they're part of the process, because they were. I didn't live the story, they did. I wanted it to be perfect for them. So I think being very open and collaborative really also helped open other doors to making sure I spoke with all the right people. Sometimes Al would say, "Oh, you need to speak with this person after reading this chapter." So that was kind of the methodology to speaking with everyone.
All right. I must say that the thing that I enjoyed most about while reading Console Wars is that amongst everything business-wise and video games-wise, you really you get to know everyone. And so when I spoke to Tom back in July and I spoke to Al yesterday, in a way I felt like I knew them, if you get what I mean.
That's the best I could ask for. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. And it's, and when I'm talking to them, they're exactly what, I don't know how to explain it, they're exactly what I expected. Because it's how they speak through the words in the book, which personally was my favourite thing about reading through it. Like I say, it was presented in a story-type context, and everyone was just very genuine. Is there anything that was left out of the book because of page constraints or too much information, or anything that you wished could have made its way in there, or?
Well, there's sort of two ways to answer that question, or two things that come to mind. One, that just from the fact that it was being published by a major publisher, HarperCollins, there were obviously things that were cut for the sake of either length or that I had an editor, which was surprisingly, for the most part, they let me have the book be almost exactly how I wanted it to be. Or how I initially envisioned it. I think they expected a 300-page book, and what they got was a 550-page book, and I really am so grateful to them for actually not just looking at the length and saying, all right, well, this is good, so let's just have it be this length. But what I mean is that I wish that I would have liked to have a bibliography. I would have also liked to have sort of a cast of characters at the beginning, or some sort of footnotes. I've tried. That was purely a length of the book thing. At one point, they asked me if I could cut the dedication to my fiance because it was taking up an extra page. So
Right.
pages were really tight, and so I've tried to compensate for not having that by making myself available to speak with anybody or to speak with any writers out there who want to understand the process. Um, and then the question is that there was so much interesting information that I had to cut from the book, and I did it because I felt like I really wanted this to be a story with a narrative. And though there were important details and important people that certainly played a role at Sega or Nintendo or another company, I didn't include them in the book because I really wanted to be true to making this the most compelling and focused narrative possible. And so those are things that I do think that a lot of people would appreciate learning about, whether it's the history of EA Sports or, like a good, my friend Sam Borowski, who passed away, and I recently wrote an article about him for IGN. So I'm going to keep trying to get those stories out through other means because, it wasn't I didn't find them important. It was that they didn't fit into the book. And another great example is Al is obviously a large part of the book. And he has fantastic stories about his time with Michael Jackson, and I love those stories. And I always ask him about him, but I just couldn't find the right way to make them feel like they were moving the story forward. So hopefully, either he'll talk more about them, or I can write something about them. But that's a good example of a guy who was a main character in the book, a guy whose stories I thought were amazing, but they just didn't really fit into what I was trying to tell at a specific time.
Yeah. How did you go about getting interest from publishers? Was it just sort of contacting all of the ones that you thought would be interested in hearing back?
It was sort of a unique process because there was also the movie projects in place prior to going to publishers, which certainly helped. But so that sort of goes back to, although this is my first book, I definitely, I had a really great manager, Julian Rosenberg, for my screenwriting and for my filmmaking. And so when I sort of told him my idea for this book and gave him a 25-page overview of the story, he set me up with a literary book agent named Alex Glass in New York City, who was willing to listen, and he really saw the potential in this. So getting an agent in the book world was a huge part of it. And then Julian also sent over the overview to Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, and that was a huge break for the project once they were involved. But the interesting thing to me was that even once we had Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg, and then Scott Rudin involved in the film project, or actually two, the documentary and the feature film, so we had this wonderful film package in place. And then we went out to publishers. We went out to 25 publishers, and 22 of the 25 passed on the book because they said, the writing is good, the story seems interesting, but video game books don't sell. Right. And I thought, well, that's kind of what? There are no video game books, or like that's the whole point of writing a book. But luckily, 3 publishers thought that trend could be changed, and HarperCollins was the one that was the best fit for us. But I just always still find that staggering. Like, I thought that even if it was a book about rival tissue companies, that if Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg, and Scott Rudin were involved, like, at least somebody would be like, well, it must be interesting, or at least their name will be on the book. Like,
I mean, it just makes sense,
Yeah.
How did the film and documentary, how did that actually come about, especially if it was before publishing?
Yeah, so that came about because I had spoken with about 100 people. I was about a year into my research, and as much as the book was for me fun and interesting, it was also very educational. It is sort of it's a business book, so there was a lot of lessons that I picked up from spending time with these people and from writing about what they did. And clearly, one of the things that Sega did so well in the early 90s was to identify celebrities or trends and sort of borrow the coolness from them, as Al would say, or just sort of find some sort of joint partnership. And so I thought, it would be really great if there was somebody more famous than myself who was involved in this book, whether it was just maybe one day tweeting about it, or just having, I didn't even know what involvement, but just being involved in some way in supporting the book. And so I literally Googled celebrity gamers, and Seth Rogen came up #1. And then I saw that he was like he especially loved the old Nintendo games and was a big Nintendo guy. And so I asked my manager, Julian, if he could send him the treatment that I had written or the overview that I had written. And I thought, there's no chance that this is going to lead to anything, but why not try?
Yeah.
And it actually did lead to something, which I was shocked by. And then it was fantastic. I went out and met with Seth and Evan for a couple of hours in January of 2012, and they really loved the story. They also, like me, were very surprised that there had never been a movie about the game business in the way of like a social network. It's about Silicon Valley and other, the true life. There's never been a true life business story or personality-driven story about the video game industry, and it's such a big industry. And so that day, they called back and said that they wanted to be involved with the documentary and with the feature film. And then it was eventually they met with Scott Rudin and talked about the project, and he was interested, and he read that at that point I had a book proposal, and he read, and then he wanted to be part of this process as well, and he's the best and biggest producer in Hollywood, and there's a reason why. And once he was interested, everything just started moving. He had a really great plan for how to move forward, and then we ended up selling the film rights to Sony Pictures. And then once all that was done, that was when we sold the book proposal. And then meanwhile, that took about somewhere between 6 and 9 months, but I'm still interviewing people and putting together the story. So that's where I say, like, it was really nice to actually have that time, though I would have loved to just have a publisher. It was really helpful in the end.
That actually reminds me, with the fact that Sony are handling the movie, it reminds me that Console Wars actually it got into the news of the industry before you had announced your book, because Sony had registered for the domain name website consolewarsmovie.com, and of course that got everyone thinking that Sony were making a Console Wars movie, presumably about Sony and Microsoft.
Absolutely.
Which...
that was my first personal and first-hand interaction with the internet and seeing how the internet works. And it was also really interesting from my end because I had met with Scott Rudin on a Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, and great meeting. And he said, I would like to try to bring this to the studio before you take the book out to publishers. Is that okay with you? And I said, yeah, whatever you say, Scott. But I didn't know how that would go. I didn't know if they would like the story. I knew that he carried a lot of weight and his interest in it would be very helpful. But, the filmmaking, the Hollywood process is always very complicated and luck-based, and maybe it would be right for a different studio. But so 2 days later, someone sent me an email and said, oh man, I'm so sorry. It looks like someone beat you to the punch. It looks like Sony's like making a movie about Console Wars. And I said, oh no, that's actually me. So as you and other people on the internet were learning about this, that was how I learned about it, though I knew that it was actually about Sega and Nintendo. So that was a really great moment for me, and also really interesting to just see that story of Sony just registering these domain names, leading to speculation that it was a promotion for the PS4 or some story about Microsoft or Sony, and people already being upset about the fact that, oh man, that's so biased that Sony's making a movie about themselves. And it was like, all right, wow.
I must say I was a little bit confused, because admittedly, I mean, the two, they are two very separate divisions within Sony. It's not like they're the same people, but at the same time, it did strike me a little bit when I read about it. I was sort of a bit, are they allowed to do that?
No, I totally understand the speculation. I don't work for Sony. I can't say for sure that how separate the divisions are. My opinion from studying Sega and Nintendo is that it's very rare that even two hands in the same subsidiary of a company know what the other ones are doing. And I will also say that from my personal experience, I wrote about Sony a lot in the book, and nobody ever told me what to write or what not to write. To say, oh, you should make Sony look like they're in a good light because, Sony's making the movie. So I feel very confident that there won't be a conflict of interest between the film division and the games division. I can't say for sure, but everything I've seen to this point makes me feel comfortable with the situation. But it is it's very interesting. Even though it is a story of Sega and Nintendo, as you see in the book, Sony does play a large role in it, and obviously beat both of them at the end of this generation. So it's funny that Sony is the one that's going to be doing the movie.
Do you think that you might be able to sneak your way into the film as a character? Maybe like as sort of like an after-credit scene or something, just have like Brad Pitt as you I think I'm going to write a book about that. Or something like that. I think you can sneak your way in.
No way, man. The whole reason I became a writer is to stay behind the scenes and never have to do anything like that. But that would be pretty funny.
How is production going on the documentary and film? Have we got sort of like ideas of release windows?
I don't think we're at the point of knowing when things will be released, but so we're basically doing the documentary and then the feature film adaptation of the book. And we already shot all the interviews for the documentary. We did that while I was writing the book, and so we're towards the end of the post-production process right now. I'd like to see a finished cut in the next few months, and then do color correction and sound mix and other last step post-production process things. But I would hope that in the first few months of 2015, we'd have a finished version of the film. And it's been a nice situation because we have been working with Seth and Evan and Scott for over 2 years now. Even though nothing has come out, it's like, even though the Hollywood process and the filmmaking process, a lot of projects get started and stopped and never happen, and who knows whether this movie will finally come to the big screen or when it will happen. But it's been really comforting to know that we've been working together for 2 years. It's been going great. They're obviously still interested in investing in the project, and so my fingers are crossed, but so far so good. And we're going to finish the documentary, and then Seth and Evan are supposed to start writing the feature film.
What are the distribution plans for the documentary? Is it going to be an online thing or a TV special? Or
I don't know yet. That's definitely a good question, and one that I think about myself a lot as the filmmaker. But there's, right now, Seth, Evan, and Scott are producing it, and so it's ultimately going to be their decision. And so, as much as I want to say, oh, is it going to be in movie theaters? Is it going to be on DVD? Is it going to be whatever? Like, I don't have control over that. But the three people who do have done a pretty damn good job with everything else they've done in their career. So I'm kind of just going to trust them and focus on making the best film. But we'll see. My dream would be for it to be in movie theaters and maybe some festival. But they're the masters, and I trust them to figure out what to do.
Well, as long as I can get hold of it over here in the UK, then I'll be fine. As it's been a bit of a hot topic recently, do you think that Nintendo could be going the way of Sega, or do you think they're going to be continuing to make hardware?
I think that they're going to continue to make hardware. Maybe not forever, but definitely any speculation as of late that, things are going very badly for them and that they might pull out and go the way of Sega. I don't think that's going to be something that happens anytime soon. If for no other reason after reading the book, you see, I would say because they're very stubborn or they really like to do things their way, but also because, there were a lot of differences between Sega and Nintendo, and I think that even though Sega decided to get out of the hardware business and focus on software, and they do make some great software titles, Nintendo's software, for the most part, I would say, is a step above what Sega's was at the time of their departure. I think that also Nintendo's intellectual properties are so much more valuable than Sega's were, and that if it ever came to it, they could find new ways to leverage those properties. Obviously, Mario and Sonic at Sega are both, I would say, top tier, and I wouldn't say one's more popular than the other, but Nintendo does have the Zelda series and Kirby and Donkey Kong, and the Mario Kart feels a little bit different, and Smash Brothers. I think that they have a lot of A+ titles that Sega didn't really have. And I think it's important to Nintendo that they stay in the hardware business in a way that I don't think it was as important to Sega. I think that Sega, as you see in the book, always had different aspirations other than just making great video games, and and most of them were successful, and most of them I think benefit us as consumers. Whether it was Sonic cartoons and whether it was other types of promotions, that's always been sort of part of the Sega identity, to be a little bit more cutting edge with that. Whereas Nintendo has been so focused on the games, and in their minds, they're artists, and the best way for their games to reach the heights that they wanted to is for them to perfect their own hardware so that it can exemplify the different aspects of those games. So, and then the other thing is that Nintendo, as far as I know and as far as I've seen financially, is extremely disciplined and has always done a wonderful job of not taking on debt and really keeping very strong books so that they can weather the storm through these tougher periods. In a way that Sega didn't, because they were much more aggressive and they had different aspirations.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd actually be very upset if Nintendo left the hardware industry. Couldn't imagine playing Zelda or Pokemon on a PlayStation system. Couldn't imagine it.
Yeah, and the only next gen system I have is my Wii U over here.
Very nice.
So I hope, too, that they stay in the hardware business. I obviously love their products. I just wish more people had it so I can play it.
So do I. As a side thing, what's your favourite game on the Wii U?
I still think Mario Kart. Mario Kart 8 is fantastic. Though I recently, for $13, bought Madden 13, since that was the only Madden game that was on... that was ever made for the Wii U, as far as I know, and that also kind of speaks to probably some of the problems that they're facing. That one of the two most popular sports franchises is not even available on the Wii U for someone like myself who just kind of wants a sports game. It doesn't even need to be the best. Obviously, since I bought one that's 2 years old, I just wanted to be able to play it, but it's not even available. So I've been playing a lot of that lately as well.
Eagerly awaiting Smash Brothers on the Wii U.
Yeah. What have you been playing?
Lately, I've been playing a lot of Bayonetta 2. Picked it up on a release day. I didn't play the original on the 360 and PS3, but I thought everyone's raving about it at the moment. I hadn't played my Wii U in about a month or so. I was waiting for the Mario Kart 8 DLCs before I sort of got back into it. And it's a really good game. Still surprising that, it still shocks me a little bit that it's the kind of game Nintendo chose to publish, but I think, personally, it was a good step forward for them. It's a good game, and it adds for a broader audience appeal.
Yeah.
And also then in a week in the US, but 2 weeks over here, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are going to be on my mind a lot. Massive Nintendo fan, so it's part of what made the book appeal to me.
Well, I'm curious about that. For the most part, or especially in the first half of the book, it's very Sega-centric, the book.
Yeah. Even
though Nintendo is discussed. What was that like for you as a Nintendo fan? Did you feel like they were fairly represented? Did you feel like they were unfairly portrayed? Because part of my intention was to show it from Sega's perspective, and they didn't have a high opinion of Nintendo. So I was wondering what you felt like throughout the reading.
At the beginning, where it was very focused on Sega, the thing that made it difficult to distinguish is obviously when there was the part on the Yamauchi family and all their history. Because it was so long ago, obviously that couldn't really be told in a story-like form with dialogue, etc. It felt like two very different sections, so it was hard to compare at that point. But once it started getting more into the 16-bit era, I thought it was very fairly represented on both sides. A lot of information on both. In fact, one of the things that stuck with me throughout until the end of the book was when I can't remember who showed it, but when Donkey Kong Country was first shown in-house, and they thought it was a Nintendo 64 game before being told it was a Super Nintendo game. I don't know why. That specific part of the book is the bit I always think of when I remember the book. I just thought that was really fascinating because it does look good. I mean, I didn't have a Super Nintendo when I was growing up. Actually, the first console I owned in my family was a Sega Saturn.
Really?
And I actually didn't realise until reading the book how unfortunate things were for the Sega Saturn. Because, I don't know, I guess at that point, games consoles weren't huge over here. Most of our games in the house were played on PC. As with most of my friends. And I think the first games console that I remember really took off was the PlayStation. And so, while growing up, I didn't have a huge preference. I mean, I mainly only played on my Game Boy, and hadn't heard of a Game Gear until I'd grown up and looked back, truthfully. I think throughout the book, it was very fair on both sides. It was clearly, written from the perspective of Sega, and you could tell how Sega felt about Nintendo, and in a sense also how Nintendo felt about Sega. But I didn't feel at any point like the writing was biased.
Great, thank you.
Do you think Sega left the hardware business at the right time?
Yeah, I do, or maybe even too late after going through this. But yeah, I do, because it is just so expensive. It was very expensive back then to be in the hardware business and to do the R&D that it took to get to the point of producing the hardware, but it has multiplied tenfold. And back then, whether it was something like the Master System or any other companies, whether it was Atari Jaguar, it was easier to absorb a failure than it was now. I mean, if the PS4 had just come out and was like a colossal flop, like that would cripple Sony.
They're already in a bad situation anyway.
Yeah, and so, it is just the barrier to entry and the stakes are just so high. And Sega, going back to the 60s, their identity has always been as an arcade. I think it makes a lot of sense for them to have bowed out and to focus on getting back to their roots in that sense, and getting away from the poker table and just being a part of that game. And it's very interesting to me that Sega and Nintendo both had their identities in the arcade business. Nintendo less so, because they started in the late 70s, but they both had a pedigree for making games before they entered the hardware business. The two companies that dominate the console today are Sony and Microsoft, who had no such background or history in making games. They're both, one's a consumer electronic company and one is a computer company. So it's interesting to me that those are the two companies still standing or still sort of at the poker table, and it's because those industries kind of also have they're bigger industries, or they're used to making these sorts of investments, and Nintendo's still hanging around, of course, but I think the hardware industry, and it was probably the right time.
When I'd finished the book, one of the things that got me thinking was a big part of what took Sega off was, of course, Sonic, which showed how important at the time it was to have a mascot for your system. And it then made me think, does Sony and Microsoft really have a mascot? I guess you could argue that Xbox has Master Chief in Halo, and Sony is sort of scattered. They sort of change who their mascot is every couple of months or so. What do you think that says about the industry and how that's changed?
I think it says a lot. I think that the number one thing it says to me is that the types of games that we play are very different. I think that I know part of the appeal to people my age or even your age of thinking about the Sega, Nintendo, 16-bit, 8-bit era is the nostalgia of it or the simplicity of it. But but there was also an element of it was almost like we were playing cartoons. It was like an escape from reality. There's nobody ever believed that the Mushroom Kingdom looked like a real place. It was a very fictional game, and you were playing in this cartoon world. But nowadays, I think a lot of the games are not trying to create a different place than reality. They're trying to simulate reality. So you have a lot of first-person shooters where the better the game is, the more lifelike it looks. That's sort of the barometer.
Yeah.
And so it's harder to have a mascot for like something that's trying to achieve reality when versus having a Mushroom Kingdom and a Green Hill Zone and these places that are supposed to look made up. It's a lot easier to have a cartoonish character really define the company. So that's interesting, and it also kind of goes back to what I was saying, that Sony is a consumer electronic company and Microsoft is a computer company. Microsoft didn't have a mascot except for maybe the paperclip guy from Windows. It was like, in those worlds, you don't really need a mascot. It's a little bit more adult skewed, and that's just not something that they're used to having. And even with the PlayStation, it was interesting to hear about Polygon Man, and also with Crash Bandicoot kind of potentially being a mascot at one point. And Sony kind of consciously shied away from wanting to have their own Sonic or their own Mario. Yeah.
One thing that always makes me think, as I've grown up, Nintendo has a weird way of appealing to two very different audiences. So Nintendo, of course, appealed to young kids more than Microsoft and Sony do necessarily. And then there's sort of a gap during what would be sort of like high school, where people will not like Nintendo because it's childish, etc.
Yeah.
And then once they've gotten past that stage, they're back into Nintendo again, whether it be because of nostalgia from when they were younger or something like that. And I think, personally, that's where sort of Microsoft and Sony have really hit home there. That middle bit where people don't want to be playing the childish games anymore while they're in school. I think that's where they've really hit their mark. Because, for instance, the Call of Duty franchise, despite it being rated 18, the majority of the players that I've met online are definitely under 18.
Right. And the other thing with those ages that you're describing, sort of like the high school, or I'll say like 13 to 18 or college, 18 to 22, those aren't just, times when people are putting aside Nintendo and looking for more adult content. That's also, I would say, when people are most sociable.
Yes.
In college, whether you're going to someone else's dorm rooms or playing online, those are the times in your life when you're really seeking out other people. And so I think that's really tremendously helped Microsoft especially, and Sony as well. But it is interesting that people kind of return to Nintendo. And I think that that's something that I'd like to see Nintendo explore in the coming years, whether it's content for their system that's more skewed towards 13 to 25-year-olds, or also taking those great IPs and finding a way to appeal to people as they get older. So, one of the really great things that Sega did during the time period described in the book is that Sonic was definitely the thing that sort of launched them into the stratosphere and got their foot in the door. But it's interesting to think that they viewed themselves as sort of a company for teens and for adults, but their mascot was somebody who was kind of meant for kids. And they did such a great job of straddling that line between being the company that does what Nintendo don't and the company that takes you to the next level, but also having a mascot that was kind of cutesy and he had attitude, but also he was, I was 10 years old and I loved Sonic. They did a great job of really leveraging Sonic without feeling like they were a kiddie company. And so I think that that's something that Nintendo could try to emulate if they wanted to, and try to strike a happy medium to appeal to high schoolers and college students.
What do you think is the biggest change now, going from sort of 16/32-bit era to now? For instance, Assassin's Creed Unity came out a couple of days ago and is full of glitches, bugs everywhere, essentially what people are calling an unfinished game. People are unable to play it, really, from where it's been rushed out. And at the same time, in the same game and in many others, we now have microtransactions. even after spending £50 or $60 on a new game. What do you think of the changes to the industry? Do you think it sort of came naturally, or just became a little too profit focused?
I think it was always very profit focused. It's just easier to see now because there are microtransactions, or there are big budget games that suffer from some flaws that you could attribute to trying to make deadlines or try to make money. But one of the really interesting things is that in the early 90s, when a game was done, it was done. That was it. There was no like updates to that game. There was no downloadable content. But nowadays, and it's probably neither better nor worse, but the game is never really finished. There's going to be updated versions of that game. There's going to be downloadable content for that game. There's going to be, there's going to be new iterations of that game that you can either buy or that are just going to naturally come because you purchased it at the right time. And, I'd hope with Assassin's Creed that they'll be able to fix some of those glitches and sort of, it's unfortunate that's how it was released, but it's not the be-all and end-all. If you had bought a copy of Zelda in 1987 and it had a glitch, that was it. You weren't going to... There was no, let me download the latest firmware update and it'll fix. So that's kind of interesting. And I think that also the fact that it's not like something that's done, you bring it into your home, and that's the end of the transaction with the software maker, with the hardware maker, it kind of creates a relationship with your hardware system that's much more intense because there's more that you're looking to get out of it, and some of that you're paying for with microtransactions, and some of it is just going to be updates that come to you, but it creates a much more personal relationship with video games and with your software and hardware providers that you didn't have back then, just because there was us and there was them, and then what bridged that gap was going to store buying something. There wasn't the direct connection that there is now. And so that's been pretty interesting.
What are your thoughts on the rise of the independent scene? For instance, in the last couple of years, I got into making games myself, mostly out of boredom. I had a lot of spare time, and the fact it's something I'd always wanted to do. And a couple of months ago, I got accepted into Nintendo's development program for the Wii U. And so once I can actually afford the development kit, I'll be able to start releasing games on Wii U. What are your thoughts on this industry that's rising a lot and is now more open console-wise than it was before?
Well, I think it's incredible. I mean, I think it's hard to not have a positive opinion of the independent, because even if you don't play the independent games, it doesn't really matter. It shouldn't make you feel bad. But what I love about it is that, in sort of the trajectory that the industry has gone the past 20 years with the technology, that leads to bigger tentpole type games like Assassin's Creed or Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty. And, those are made with a budget similar to some Hollywood films, and you can actually see it looks lifelike, special effects of a movie, but sort of in the same way that I think in the early 90s with film, and especially now, the independent scene has really risen. It's that same thing of technology, but instead of making a $150 million movie or a $50 million game, that technology is now enabling people to do things on smaller budgets because the technology cost has come down. So the fact that you're able to make a game without, I would assume, spending millions of dollars to make it happen is a wonderful thing. And it also, I think, sort of creates a checks and balance type system, because in the film world, there's always going to be the big budget movies that are based on books or based on properties that you already know, and they're not going to be as risky as an original idea. And I wouldn't want to take that risk if I was a studio executive, but I would love for 10 independent people to take a risk at a fraction of the cost, and hopefully one of them will succeed. And the other thing I really love about independent game making, I don't know if it's just you or if it's you and a small team, but I think one of the really nice things about the games from the 80s and from the 90s, or even going back to the 70s, is that these were usually programmed by one, two, three people, small teams. And whether the games were good or bad, they always seemed to have like a very specific vision. Like you felt like it was someone's voice. And that's nice. I think that Toe Jam and Earl is the kind of game that only would have been created with a couple of people making the game because it's so weird and quirky. And if there was a lot of cooks in the kitchen, they would say, oh, maybe that's a little too weird, or let's hedge this. But you get those weird things. And whether you like it or not, I like that there's just these games with very distinct visions, and that sort of goes away as things become more expensive for obvious and understandable reasons. But empowering one or two developers to make games does sort of bring back that really unique voice, which I think that the industry is missing, and it'll help. I think that the bigger budget games can learn from those things, and also there should be this dichotomy of if you want a $50 million game, you're probably going to like it. It's probably going to be a great game, but it's going to be a certain kind of game. And then if you want to buy a $5 game from the virtual store, or if you want to buy a game on your phone, it's going to have a more specific voice. It'll be a different kind of game.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think it's great how technology nowadays, and also especially because of the internet, it's made anyone can do anything they want to, really, now. Right. You can look at it that way. Have you considered writing a sequel to Console Wars for a different era?
Yeah, I have. I think that when I turned in the book, after spending 3 years working on it, I was ready to say sayonara to the video game industry. Just because there was a lot of baggage and stress, and it was all good things, but it was just like, I am glad to be done with this really large undertaking. But every day since it's been finished or since it's been published, I really miss writing about that world, and I'm looking to get back into it with some of these smaller stories. But I would really like to sort of just follow the thread and see where things went. I can extrapolate what I learned and try to figure out or try to understand why Sega left the hardware industry, but I'd love to be able to better answer that question if they left at the right time. Ultimately, getting back to your original question, or one of your original questions, what made me write this book? It was personal curiosity. I wanted to read it; it didn't exist, and I wanted to talk to these people. I wanted to find out what happened. So, as long as the curiosity is there, and it's not just some sort of cash grab, or I have nothing else better to do, so I'm like, I just guess I'll keep going. If I feel that, scorching sense of curiosity, I think the book will be good, and I think that I am starting to really feel that curiosity about what came after the time period in Console Wars, what's going on nowadays, and also going back to the earlier days of the Magnavox Odyssey and the Atari 2600 or Atari Pong First. A lot of these things. I find myself being very curious about them, and I think that I would love for that to lead to another book in the next few years.
Good. I'd definitely purchase it after reading Console Wars, because there was so much information about the sort of late 8-bit and the 16-bit generation. I feel like I know so much about those generations that it feels like I know nearly nothing then about the 32-bit and onwards. I'd
also say that if I don't write a sequel, or even if I do write a sequel, one of the main goals of writing this book and trying to write it in an accessible way that introduces people to this industry and makes them familiar with the 8 and 16-bit generation was I really wanted more people to write books about this, and also for more publishers to be willing to publish books on this. And, my experience was that 22 of 25 said no because it's a video game book. I hope that the next person, that number is less, and they'll say, all right, there is a successful video game book. Maybe this will be more successful, maybe it'll be less, but at least they'll be more open to it. And so I'm not the first person to write a book about video games, but I'm hoping like David Sheff and Harold Goldberg and Jeff Ryan to just kind of keep pushing the door wider open for other people to write about the industry. And I will definitely read any other books out there. So I would like to learn more about the other eras as well, and I hope that other people will be writing books.
I'm not really sure about this, and I don't know if you know. Eventually, console manufacturers just sort of stopped boasting about how many bits their system had.
Yeah.
We went into the 32-bit era, and it was occasionally mentioned, and obviously Nintendo had a 64-bit system with 64 in the name. But past that, we didn't really hear much about bits or why they mattered. Or was it all just marketing the whole time? Or
Yeah, I think that it is interesting to think about why, why was there not a 128-bit generation that was discussed in that way. I think that people don't realize how much the 16-bit battle was a matter of Sega saying, hey, what do we have that's better than Nintendo? Oh, 16 bits, and sort of making a big deal of sort of saying that that's where it came from to some extent. And I think that a lot of what changed also is that I think people really associated bits with cartridges.
right?
And so when we went into everything either being CD-based or DVD-based or some sort of disc, there was this disassociation with the bits. And it's interesting that N64 was kind of the last one, and they did have cartridges and not CDs like Saturn and like PlayStation. But I'm surprised that nobody, even just for marketing purposes, said we're the first, 256-bit company or something like.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm surprised that it fell off the map so quickly. That lexicon to describe what these hardware makers were doing.
What's your personal opinion on Nintendo's kind of hesitance about ordinary CD formats? Because even after the 64, GameCube had the mini discs, and both the Wii and the Wii U have had their own kind of CD format as opposed to plain CD or DVD. Yeah,
well, I think that this would probably sound more negative than it is, but Nintendo doesn't really play nice with others. I think that we all benefit from the upside of that, which is that when they're playing by themselves, they do extraordinary things. But it's very interesting and should stick out that when PlayStation and Saturn both had CDs, the N64 had cartridges. And then when the PS2 had DVDs, I believe, and the Dreamcast, I don't know if it was DVD-based, but it was at least, I think it was.
I think so.
Even though I don't think you could play DVDs on it
No.
like you could on the PS2. Nintendo had their proprietary small GameCube discs, and even with the Wii and with the, I guess the Wii U, does it now play? I've never played a Blu-ray on it.
The Wii U, it holds the same capacity as a Blu-ray disc, but it's I think Panasonic they worked with. It's their own kind of disc that they use in the Wii U.
I remember throughout college a big appeal of PS1 and was playing CDs, and PS2 was playing DVDs, and PS3 was playing Blu-rays. Like that was a big part of they're a consumer electronic company, and they wanted to say it's not just for games. If you're going to spend $200 on a DVD player, you may as well spend an extra $100 and get a game player.
Yeah.
But Nintendo does not want to be part of that. They want their console to be devoted exclusively to games and being devoted exclusively to Nintendo games or Nintendo-approved games. And the fact that both you and I love Nintendo for that, or in spite of that, shows that we obviously like, one of the things that it does for them to have such a lock and key on the system is to ensure certain quality. And I've always felt like anytime I spent $50 on a game, I've gotten at least $50 worth of entertainment out of a Nintendo game. I can't say the same for Microsoft, Sony, or Sega. But there is a downside that comes with that. And from a business standpoint, sometimes I find it a little bit baffling that they continue to be such a closed system. But they do, and I don't see that changing.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the Wii, strangely enough, the first and second sort of batches of the Wii before the hardware got a little bit altered to avoid it, where people could quite easily hack it and have their own homebrew software, you could get a homebrew DVD player. The Wii physically could play DVDs, and it was just something that was never taken further. And I think what you mentioned about them being more of a closed-off company, it works in a sort of similar way that it does with Apple. Apple are also very closed off, and not just in terms of business, but also in terms of their actual hardware. And I guess it's just because Apple has Apple fans who will always line up days in advance to buy their products, And what they do have is so good and people like it so much that I guess in a way it doesn't really matter that they don't offer these extra things. It's all about the games with Nintendo.
No, that's true. There's a lot of similarities between Apple and Nintendo. And, once I sort of saw things from that perspective, it helped me understand Nintendo a little bit better, because hearing it from Tom and Al, they were the villain in the story. But I could at least sympathize with why they did a lot of what they did. But I would say that Apple is much more open to seemingly to partnerships, or at least on the content side. The promotion that they recently did with U2, which people object to getting the free music in their cloud or whatever, like that doesn't seem like something Nintendo would do to me. That they would, basically, I feel like Nintendo either wants it to be theirs or they don't want it at all. iTunes in that situation didn't say like YouTube is our exclusive artist that we own and we're this, it was a one-time thing or it was a special relationship. But I felt like Apple is much more aggressive in making those sort of big partnerships where it is exclusively distributed through Apple, but it doesn't have to be created by Apple. And I don't feel like Apple was involved in the recording session saying, no, that's not how it would be on Nintendo. Like Nintendo still is such a micromanager when it comes to those kinds of things. And for the most part, it benefits us, but I worry that it's hurting them in certain ways.
Yeah. As I asked Tom and Al, what is your thoughts on Sonic Boom and the redesigns that the characters have had?
Well, I know Al does not like the scarf, and I don't really like it either. I think it's really weird. I mean, the one that stands out is Knuckles.
Oh.
It's really weird to see him like that, but that's also maybe kind of a byproduct of he always seemed a little too similar to Sonic, maybe.
Yeah.
I know that he had a little bit different attitude, but like there was a similar look and a similar feel to him, especially he was kind of a rebel when Sonic himself was a rebel.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that for the most part, I like it. There's things I would have done differently, like the scarf is a good example, and there's things that don't sit well with me at first, like the Knuckles thing. But when you think about it's almost 25 years later, and taking this incredible game that Naka and Oshima-san made, and that Al and Tom and Madeline and everyone helped turn into a cultural icon that he's still as relevant as ever. Especially when there hasn't been a hugely successful Sonic game, I would say. I mean, I love Sonic Generations and I like some of the games, but I don't think there's been that like big zeitgeisty game as of late, and he's still as popular as ever. I think that to keep him relevant for this next generation after, that's still, I think it's a really good thing what Sega has been doing, and how they've really been making such a big deal out of Sonic Boom and looking at the animated series as well.
Yeah. And I guess to close off, is there anything you would like to say to everyone specifically?
Is there any sort of prompt you can give me about what kind of message I should be
as to whether it's just buy my book now, or whether you've got any advice for people who would like to be authors? I know a lot of people. I know a few people actually who, after reading Console Wars, have been sort of like, oh, I want to write something about video games.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the number one response that I was looking for to the book was from the people themselves: Tom, Al, Peter, Howard, Gail. I wanted to do right by them. I didn't live the story; they lived it. It was so important to me that they loved it. Aside from my family and my fiance, their opinion more than any other reviewer was the one that I cared about most. The second biggest response that I was looking for was I would have loved for people to read it and make them and inspire them to want to write more about the video game industry, or to write more accessible, character-driven histories, which is what I like to read and what I think is a really successful way to tell a story. So the only thing that the only message I would want to say, I guess, is thank you, and I'm glad that you had that response, and that I urge anybody to contact me on Twitter as you did, um, to see if I can help them in any way to try to make that dream a reality, or if there's anything I can do advice wise or be a sounding board. I'd love for my book in some way to lead to other similar types of books. So contact me at J Harris NYC at Twitter, and let me know if I can help in any way.
Fantastic. A link to your Twitter page will be in the description, as will a link to Buy Console Wars. If you happen to have not read it, definitely recommend you do, whether you're a gamer or just interested in business. And so, yeah, it'd be great if you could send me some details about your show. I'd love to check it out. And yeah, thank you very much for giving up your time to talk to me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Have a good one.
You too.